Hello. I do believe we're live. So, welcome to the Saturday streaming edition of Adam's Music Box, where today the theme is Las Vegas. Now, why am I thinking of this? Well, as most of you know, I'm a huge Van Halen fan, not a band necessarily associated at all with Vegas, but Sammy Hagar has taken his Best of All Worlds tour, the closest thing we'll ever get to a Van Halen tribute, and he's begun a residency in Las Vegas. And this got me thinking about what Las Vegas is most known for. And of course, it's most known for gambling. But what's the second thing that it is most known for? Well, I would have to say music. And for those of you out there thinking, no, prostitution is not legal in Las Vegas, it's legal in the state of Nevada, but it's a county by county thing. You have to drive about an hour outside of Las Vegas if you want some of that. And who am I to judge? So back to the prostitution. I mean, music. There's a bit of that, but that's mostly limited to the music industry. So Las Vegas and music, it's been a long relationship, almost as long as gambling and Vegas itself. Now, Vegas was initially set up by some organized criminals, gangsters like Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky. And one of the earliest musicians to perform in Vegas was none other than Liberace, who became a household name in Vegas up until his death. He was one of the first acts to play there in the 1940s. But Las Vegas kind of got off to a slowish start. But two things happened in the 1950s that made it a major destination for people wanting gambling and a good time, and the musicians soon followed. Now, what were these two events? Well, for one, we have to go to Cuba, and for the other, we have to go to a part of Los Angeles County that was unincorporated right up until the early 1980s. Now, right smack in the middle of the heart of sort of glamorous LA, in between Hollywood and Beverly Hills, there was a place known as Sherman, which then eventually, for marketing reasons, took on the name West Hollywood. Now, this was an area that was unincorporated, meaning the LAPD and LA city regulations did not apply. In this area was and still is the Sunset Strip. And on the Sunset Strip in the 40s and 50s were many casinos. Now, gambling was not legal in this area or in anywhere in LA at that time, but it happened. And people like Mickey Cohen, another mobster, were very much instrumental in running the gambling racket on the Sunset Strip. By the mid 1950s, this started to get cracked down on, and the mob violence made some of the locals who were otherwise tolerant or embracing of the gambling culture, it led them to think, we don't really like all of this going on. And so Cohen went to Vegas and he started attempting to attract the same kinds of people to Vegas who would gamble on Sunset Boulevard. Now, in order to create more of a draw, and most importantly at the time, to make Vegas seem respectable, you had to bring some of the performance artists, some of the musicians who were well known on the Sunset Strip. Now, one of these men was Frank Sinatra, another was Dean Martin, and before you know it, the whole Rat Pack, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop, they were all staples in Vegas by the end of the 1950s and well into the following decades. Other performers who were big in Vegas at the time and who were very widely loved at the time were people like Louis Prima, Jump, Jive, and Wail, people like Judy Garland, who was still very popular at the time, people like Lena Horne. And then by the early 60s, a very young and still very much alive Wayne Newton became a major fixture of Las Vegas. Now, at the end of the 50s, something else happened which only worked to improve Las Vegas's fortunes as a big draw for people who wanted to gamble and be entertained between gambling sessions. And this was the communist revolution in Cuba, which shut down all of those casinos there. So with Sunset Strip taken out of the equation for gambling, and Cuba on the other side of the U.S. taken out, well, it's not in the, you know what I mean, taken out of the equation for gambling, people were drawn to Vegas more and more. And Vegas became a place where all of the cool entertainers of this classic pop era that we refer to really became household names. Obviously, they were huge everywhere. And this is actually an important part of the story. While people like Sinatra and Dean Martin and Wayne Newton were big in Vegas in the 50s and well into the 60s, they were also popular in New York, Chicago, London, Paris, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Tokyo, and any other big music cities around the world. In other words, Vegas was chic, Vegas was cool. Elvis, by the late 50s, became a major fixture in Vegas, and he remained so right up until his final years. Now, Vegas by the end of the 60s was the place. The hotels were getting bigger and more beautiful. The casinos were getting more elaborate. It had become part of Americana and part of the international landscape for music. But by the 70s, the music industry had started to change. And this is a narrative that I've talked about before. Now, what are some of these things that changed? Well, rock and roll went from being a youthful and rebellious style of music to, by the early 70s, it was the lingua franca of pop music. In other words, major pop acts of the 70s, whether the Carpenters or the Osmonds or Elton John, not necessarily rock and roll acts per se, but they were playing the kinds of music that was rock and roll adjacent. And it was the arrangements that really made this clear. So while the classic pop of the 40s, 50s, and the first half of the 60s, you had string sections, you had jazz style drumming, swinging rather than a backbeat style of drumming, you had brass, you had saxophones. By the 70s, if you wanted to record a pop record, you'd probably have not upright bass, but electric bass. You'd have at least one electric guitar, and you'd have much less brass and saxophone, but a bit more Hammond organ, a bit more Fender Rhodes electric piano. The musical idiom was changing. And Vegas went on mostly ignoring this because there were still plenty of people who were young enough and mobile enough and rich enough to want to go to Vegas. But the people by the end of the 70s who weren't going to Vegas were the young people, because Vegas at that time was not a friendly city for rock and roll music, with the exception of Elvis, who by then was sort of a pop artist in many ways. It was not friendly to soul, funk, or R&B. So, but in the 70s, George Clinton was very cool. The Isley Brothers were cool. The Doobie Brothers were cool. Led Zeppelin was cool. Van Halen came out in 1978. Very cool. Very on Las Vegas. And the 80s is sometimes seen as a kind of decline in Las Vegas. Yes, the sports were very good, particularly martial arts. Boxing has always been big in Vegas. And Sinatra never goes out of fashion, but he was old by the 1980s. And Elvis was gone, but Elvis impersonators were there again. Fun, sure. Cool, not necessarily. In the 80s, this was the era of, Michael Jackson and Prince and Duran Duran and Culture Club and Iron Maiden and Judas Priest and Van Halen again. It wasn't necessarily the people, the Wayne Newtons of the world, who were popular in Las Vegas. And then at the end of the 80s, something else happened which started to really threaten the dominance of Vegas, not only as an entertainment capital, but also as a gambling capital. And this was the revitalization of the old Atlantic City boardwalk in New Jersey, an area that is surrounded by very, very large cities as opposed to being in the desert. And so you had people like the Rolling Stones, like Michael Jackson, like Pavarotti, performing at the Trump Taj Mahal, the best casino that you've ever seen in the world. It's terrific. You started seeing them playing there again, drawing things out from Las Vegas. But Las Vegas, pardon me, Las Vegas wasn't by any means done. And to understand what happened to Vegas in the 90s, you have to look at two men who had been part of the Vegas scene on and off, mostly on, since the end of the 1960s. And this was Siegfried and Roy, two German magicians who specialized in doing magic involving large animals, lions, tigers, elephants that disappeared, and all of that. Now, in the 70s and 80s, magic even by Vegas standards, was considered a bit passe. But Siegfried and Roy were always able to draw in big audiences because their magic was really sort of Broadway esque. It took things to a different level. It wasn't just sort of a drunk guy pulling rabbits out of the hat. It was these two very flamboyant and very sort of choreographed, very exotic type of German people, yeah, is good, yeah, who are doing all of these tricks with these exotic animals. And they really started to up the production quality by the late 80s and early 90s. And this is where a man called Stephen Wynn gets involved. He gave Siegfried and Roy the biggest budget that any show in Vegas had ever had. I mean, think about it. With Elvis, you would have been paying for the orchestra, you would have been paying for the sedatives backstage, you'd have been paying for the lights, etc. Frank Sinatra, I mean, a microphone, an orchestra, and martinis. That was the budget. But when you're talking about lions and elephants and a light show and 100 choreographed Broadway style dancers, this was a huge gamble, if you'll pardon the pun. But like some gambles in Vegas, it paid off. And Siegfried and Roy signaled a new era for Vegas in the 90s, where it became known as more as an all purpose entertainment destination than a place to gamble and see a bit of Sammy Davis Jr. in between your gambling. Now, the 90s was also the era when Sinatra died, Dean Martin died, Sammy Davis had died a few years earlier, and so that generation was gone. Elvis was gone. But a new generation of performers who were into theatrics and magic, David Copperfield, Cirque du Soleil, EFX with Michael Crawford, these types of shows became domineering in the 90s, and Vegas sort of rebranded itself as a city for families. So, and Siegfried and Roy were actually part of that too. They didn't want strippers at their show. It was typical for magic acts in Vegas to perform along with the strippers, but Siegfried and Roy weren't into that. I cannot imagine why, but they weren't. And so that also changed a lot about Las Vegas. And so while Atlantic City sort of took on the role of the old Vegas, a more adult theme, I like them grown up. I like them so grown. Vegas was more of a place where you would say, okay, let's, fly out to Vegas. The parents will do a bit of gambling, and then we'll all go see the magic show. In the words of Dave Chappelle, no one goes to see people be safe with tigers. I think one of them might get bit. I'd like to see that for $35. And that was how Dave Chappelle accurately described the Vegas of the 1990s. Now, by the early 2000s, the big budgets got even bigger, and this began to reattract some of the major music artists that really Vegas had been hemorrhaging ever since the 80s. You had people like Celine Dion doing residencies, and she was very, very big in the late 90s, early 2000s. I mean, she was riding on the Titanic, and she seemed to ride it for a bit longer than Leonardo DiCaprio and the other one. Prince came to Las Vegas, and if Prince does it, it becomes cool. Elton John, always in style, he did Vegas. Shania Twain, Britney Spears, Jennifer Lopez, all of these people did Vegas shows. And so it once again became sort of both a place for family entertainment and a place where the over 18s could go to see the biggest artists of the day, the kinds of people who would also be playing at the LA Forum and at Madison Square Garden, etc. Now, where are we today? Well, we're at an interesting junction today for several reasons, and some of these reasons are well beyond the control of any of the casino owners in Las Vegas. One of the reasons is that the average American family is getting smaller. This is particularly true of white and black families, and even Hispanic Americans are now having fewer kids than they did 10 years ago. But among the white and black population, families are getting smaller. And if you're building a city, an entertainment city around family entertainment, we're going to start to see some of those problems. Other problems beyond the direct control of Vegas have happened as well. While Atlantic City's golden years have sort of gone and it sort of returned to what it was when Bruce Springsteen was singing about how bad it was in the early 70s, we have online sports gambling in most parts of America, and some people with VPNs can use them anywhere. Ooh, spooky. And so again, that's another thing that people can now do on their phone. And so that is taking its toll on Las Vegas. And so, what does the future really hold for Las Vegas? And I think I have some ideas. What we're seeing right now is sort of a combination of several things. You have a lot of residencies for comedians, where Vegas has now become cool for comedians. In the 70s and 80s, it was not cool for comedians because that was the age of the local comedy club. In the 80s, cities around America started to have their own comedy specific clubs. Before that, as Jay Leno will attest to, comedy was a warm up act for jazz and small rock bands. It was a warm up act for strippers, and for the more edgy comedy, you would have them in coffee shops. So you'd smoke a bit of a joint by the dumpster, have a triple espresso, and hear a 1975 iteration of George Carlin rant about how bad the Nixon administration was. No Vegas type of comedy there. But now you have a lot of that. And what you're also seeing is legacy artists doing big shows in Vegas. Now, why are they doing that? Well, there are several reasons. And Sammy Hagar, who's very open about the fact that he's closer to the end of his career than the beginning, but still going strong, he said, look, touring is difficult when he's at his age. He doesn't really need to do it for the money at all. His drink business, the rum and tequila, that made him more money even than he ever made in Van Halen. So, but he loves performing, doesn't love touring. Easy solution: do 3 months in Las Vegas. You wake up in the same bed, you can sleep in, no planes to catch, no taxis or any of the rest of it, no cost to haul the stage lighting and the instruments all across the world. The stuff is at the casino. You do, I think, 3 or 4 gigs a week. I think that's around the number. And you get to hang out at the restaurant you own in between that time and just enjoying the fine amenities of an entertainment city. A lot of people now are doing it. And you also have places like the Sphere, which are good for artists who don't really need to have much of a setup. The light show is built into the venue. The light show is the venue. So you have the Eagles who have done gigs there. U2 has done gigs there. Again, these are now legacy acts, very popular, particularly among boomers and some of the older Gen X people. I don't want to discriminate. Young people can like them too, and some do. But that is still the main demographic. Now, as we shift forward, I actually think Las Vegas, in order to survive various headwinds that I think have nothing to do with macroeconomics and everything to do with declining family sizes and the internet, I think that they might actually have to pivot back to be more of an adult friendly type of place, the way it was in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So, in other words, gambling on sort of on various kinds of novel sports. I've seen things like slapping contests. I think we might see Daredevil type of stuff coming back. It's all over YouTube. Why not come to Vegas and bet on it? I think they might have to revive that chapter of Las Vegas history. I think that they might have to lean into the raunchier side of things, but I do see a bright future for Vegas. And here's why. So many of the popular music acts of this era are people that are highly reliant on choreography and lighting. Every major artist is now, they're sort of like a young person's Vegas. The age of, 4 guys with a guitar, a bass, and drums just strumming away. That's not really happening. A crooner crooning into a microphone with an orchestra wearing tuxedos. That's sort of long gone. And hip hop, which is a very lyrical format, in order to work at big venues, hip hop has to integrate theatrics. Ye, formerly known as Kanye West, was the king of that, still is in many quarters. Now, what's going to happen? Well, imagine this. Imagine when Taylor Swift starts to look like Hillary Clinton and when Drake starts to look like Red Fox. When that happens, Las Vegas will be calling. And when the people of the sort of Gen Z and the younger millennials get older, I could see them making a weekend in Vegas, seeing a, 55-year-old Taylor Swift shaking the Hillary Clinton thighs of that period of time, seeing Drake the next day looking a bit like Red Fox, but with maybe a smoother smoother haircut, and doing their thing. So I think what goes around sort of comes around. Vegas will always, because of generational shifts, be a seesaw between the cool and the uncool. But there's a market for both of those things so long as you know how to market it right. The Elvis impersonators and the people that were a bit out of whack were still drawing people into Vegas, and the sleaziness of it in the has-been era of the 80s, it had a certain kind of charm. ZZ Top's remake of Elvis's Viva Las Vegas at the very beginning of the 90s sort of paid tribute to the end of sleazy Las Vegas, right at the dawn of the sort of Cirque du Soleil, David Copperfield, Siegfried and Roy Broadway style of Las Vegas. So I think that there will always be a role for a city based around gambling and entertainment, because people are always going to want to gamble and they're always going to want to be entertained. The question is, what kind of entertainment? And I see that when today's sort of very choreographed artists become yesterday's news, and I'm using Taylor Swift and Drake somewhat facetiously, they're so big they'll always probably be able to do the world tours. But think of the lesser versions of them in terms of popularity. I could see them doing Vegas, because while you might not want to pay $100 to see a has-been shake their booty at the LA Forum on a Tuesday night, if you're spending a weekend in Vegas, gambling away and drinking up, I think that you will say, hell, this guy that was really big back in 2015, you might want to see that person in Vegas. And so, as the boomer rock bands sort of help Vegas in this transition period, I think that the millennial artists and eventually the Gen Z artists will find a very good home in Vegas, because that style of music ostensibly lends itself more to Vegas than anything else. It's one part showgirl because a lot of it is very sexual in terms of the choreography. It's one part magic show because a lot of it involves a lot of trickery of light and smoke and mirrors. So, as I said, what goes around comes around, and there will always be a Las Vegas, for better or for worse. That's what I think, though. Let me know what you think, and as always, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.